The Vox transmission crackled through the Eternal Vigil's communications array at 03:47 hours, ship time, dragging Inquisitor Castellan Vex from her meditative prayers with the sharp urgency of impossibility. Static-laced voices chanted backwards litanies in High Gothic, their cadence wrong, their words flowing in reverse like blood drawn back into a wound. She pressed her palm against the cold metal of her private sanctum's wall, feeling the ship's superstructure vibrate with the incoming signal's resonance. "Impossible," she whispered, but the servo skull hovering beside her alcove projected the transmission data with mechanical certainty. Source coordinates, Mortis Thule. Authentication codes, Forsaken Chapter, Adeptus Astartes. Vex's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the temporal stamp. The signal carried today's date, but the background radiation signatures belonged to stellar phenomena that had ceased 17 years ago. The Forsaken Chapter was extinct. Vex had filed the termination orders herself after the catastrophic warp storm that consumed their fortress monastery, along with all 1,000 battle brothers. The orbital bombardment had been thorough, the gene seed recovery impossible, the records sealed under Ordo Malleus authority. Yet here was their voice, threading through the void silence like a prayer spoken by the dead. She activated the communication array's analysis protocols, her fingers dancing across rune keys that had grown familiar through decades of hunting heresy in the galaxy's darkest corners. The backwards litanies resolved into words as the cogitator reversed their flow. "Emperor, preserve us from the counting, the endless counting, the numbers that add to nothing and everything." The voice belonged to Chapter Master Korath, whose gene-locked vocal patterns remained in Imperial records despite his confirmed death during the monastery's final moments. Beneath the chanting, bolter fire echoed in rhythmic bursts that followed no Imperial firing doctrine. Vex counted the shots, 37 rounds in sequences of 13, pausing for exactly 4 seconds between volleys. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, as if the battle being fought existed in a loop, replaying the same tactical exchanges across eternity. Her servo skull's auspex detected chrono distortion in the weapon signatures. The bolter rounds were impacting before the triggers were pulled, their muzzle flashes illuminating targets that had already fallen. "Castellan!" Her interrogator's voice reached her through the sanctum's vox grill. Thane's tone carried the controlled urgency of a man trained to report impossibilities with bureaucratic precision. "The Astropath Sanctum is requesting immediate consultation. They're receiving echoes." Vex sealed her meditation chamber and moved through the Eternal Vigil's corridors with measured steps, her power armor's servos humming in harmony with the ship's environmental systems. The strike cruiser had served her for 3 decades, its machine spirit attuned to her hunting patterns. But tonight, its passages felt different, longer somehow, as if distance itself had become negotiable. She passed viewports, showing the same star configurations she had memorized years ago, yet their light seemed to bend toward Mortis Thule's coordinates with gravitational insistence. The Astropath Sanctum reeked of ozone and sacred oils, its psychic dampening fields creating pressure that settled behind her eyes, like the promise of a migraine. Astropath Prime Velus floated in his suspensor throne, his empty sockets weeping tears of silver, while his withered hands traced patterns in the air that left phosphorescent after-images. The other choir members sat in their meditation alcoves, their minds linked in the delicate communion required for long-range psychic communication. "Show me," Vex commanded. Velus's mouth opened, but Chapter Master Korath's voice emerged. "The counting continues, Inquisitor. We have held our positions for 17 years, 4 months, 13 days. The enemy advances, but never arrives. Our ammunition depletes, but never empties. Brothers fall, but never die." The Astropath's face contorted with effort as foreign words forced themselves through his vocal cords. "We request immediate reinforcement. The monastery's walls hold, but the shadows point skyward now, and the Emperor's light casts darkness." The transmission ended, leaving the sanctum filled with the soft whine of cooling Vox equipment. Vex studied the data streams flowing across the chamber's cogitator displays, each one confirming details that violated fundamental laws of Imperial physics. The signal's origin point registered life signs, exactly 1,000 biosignatures, each bearing the enhanced physiological markers of Adeptus Astartes' gene modifications. The readings were too perfect, too precisely matched to the Forsaken chapter's original roster. It was as if the monastery's destruction had never occurred, as if 17 years of confirmed extinction had been nothing more than administrative error. "Prep the strike force," Vex ordered, her decision crystallizing with the weight of inevitability. "Full tactical deployment. We translate to Mortis Thule within the hour." Thane's objection was immediate and expected. "Castellan, Ordo Malleus protocols require verification of—" "The protocols assume normal causality," Vex interrupted, watching the star charts update as the Eternal Vigil's navigator began plotting their course. "This transmission originated from coordinates that shouldn't exist, delivered by voices that can't speak. We investigate because the alternative is accepting that our understanding of reality contains gaps large enough for entire chapters to fall through." The translation to warp space felt different this time, the ship's Geller fields straining against currents that pulled in directions orthogonal to normal space-time. Vex stood in the observation deck's central alcove, watching the Imperium's chaotic energies flow around their vessel's protective barrier. The warp storms that had consumed Mortis Thule 17 years ago were gone, replaced by eerily calm passages that seemed to guide them toward their destination with unsettling efficiency. When they emerged into real space, the Mortis Thule system appeared exactly as Imperial records described: twin suns, 7 lifeless worlds, and the debris field where the Forsaken chapter's fleet had made its final stand. But sensors immediately registered anomalies that made Vex's augmetic eye click with rapid focusing adjustments. The fourth planet, where the fortress monastery had stood, showed no signs of orbital bombardment. Its surface gleamed with intact structures, their Gothic spires reaching towards space with architectural defiance. "Life signs confirmed," the sensor servitor reported in its emotionless monotone. 1,000 enhanced human biosignatures. Fortress monastery structural integrity at 97%. No signs of combat damage or environmental hazards. Vex gripped the observation deck's rail, feeling cold metal bite through her gauntlets as she processed the impossible data. Through the viewport, Mortis Thule hung against the starfield like a jewel of denial, its surface unmarked by the destruction she had personally authorized. The fortress monastery's cathedral spires pierced the atmosphere with Gothic magnificence, their shadows falling across the planet's surface in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Those shadows pointed upward, toward the twin suns, defying the basic physics that governed light and darkness. As she watched, the shadows moved independently of their casting structures, rotating slowly to track the Eternal Vigil's orbital position, like accusing fingers following their approach. "Prepare the Thunderhawk," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "We're going down there." The Thunderhawk's descent through Mortis Thule's atmosphere carried an unnatural smoothness, as if the planet's gravitational field welcomed their approach rather than resisting it. Vex felt the wrongness in her bones. Decades of atmospheric insertions had taught her to expect turbulence, wind shear, the hostile embrace of alien skies. Instead, the gunship glided toward the fortress monastery's landing platform with the serene inevitability of a funeral barge approaching its final berth. Through the tactical display, she studied her deployment team, Tech Adept Zephyr 9, his crimson robes concealing augmetic modifications that transformed him into a walking sensor array. Interrogator Thane, whose scarred face bore the patient marks of a man who had extracted confessions from heretics across a dozen sectors. And a squad of Tempestus Scions, whose silence spoke of combat experience in theaters too classified for casual discussion. Each bore the tools of their trade: auspexes, gene scanners, melter charges, the portable arsenal of Imperial investigation. Chrono distortion detected, Zephyr 9 announced, his Vox grill crackling with binary cant undertones. Local temporal flow exhibits quantum fluctuation patterns. Recommend enhanced chronometer monitoring. His mechadendrites writhed with agitation as they processed sensor data that violated fundamental principles of Mechanicus doctrine. Vex activated her own chronometer, watching its digits count forward with metronomic precision. 37 seconds passed, then the display flickered. The numbers began running backward. 37, 36, 35. Before snapping back to correct temporal alignment with a soft chime that sounded almost apologetic. She had witnessed time itself hesitate, as if the planet's surface existed in a state of temporal uncertainty. The landing platform materialized beneath them with architectural impossibility. Imperial records showed this structure as a cratered ruin, its rockcrete surfaces melted by orbital lance strikes that had carved through the planet's crust. Instead, the platform bore fresh, Aquila pattern landing markers, their paint bright enough to suggest recent maintenance. The Thunderhawk's engines cycled down with satisfied mechanical purrs, their machine spirit apparently detecting no environmental hazards, despite the obvious impossibility of their surroundings. Atmospheric composition nominal, Thane reported, his auspex sweeping across readings that matched pre-bombardment survey data. No residual radiation, no toxic particulates, air pressure and oxygen content within acceptable ranges for unaugmented human survival. His tone carried the bewilderment of a man reporting that water flowed upward and fire burned cold. They disembarked onto rockcrete that felt solid beneath their boots, yet Vex's weight-sensitive pressure plates detected subtle give, as if the platform existed in a state of structural uncertainty. The fortress monastery's main gates loomed before them, Gothic arches decorated with carved aquilus that watched their approach with stone eyes that seemed to track movement. The gates themselves stood partially open, revealing shadowed passages that beckoned with architectural invitation. Zephyr 9's auspex emitted rapid clicking sounds as it processed impossible data streams. Massive Vox activity detected within the structure, he reported, his organic eye wide with technological confusion. Thousands of overlapping transmission sources. Signal analysis indicates ancient Terran linguistic patterns, some predating Imperial standardization by millennia. Whatever is broadcasting in there has been speaking continuously for... His cogitators paused, processing calculations that strained their capacity. An indeterminate period. The transmission layers suggest temporal stratification, multiple time periods broadcasting simultaneously. The gates bore fresh Imperial aquilus carved over older symbols that hurt to observe directly. Vex's augmetic eye automatically adjusted its focus, but the underlying heretical markings seemed to shift position when viewed peripherally, writhing beneath their Imperial coverings like living things trapped under stone skin. She traced one Aquila's outline with her gauntleted finger, feeling warmth pulse through the carved stone as if blood flowed beneath its surface. Movement patterns ahead, Thane announced, his long-range scope trained on the entrance hall's shadows. Single set of footprints, ceramite tread pattern consistent with Astartes' power armor, but... He paused, his scope's machine spirit struggling to process what it observed. The tread depth indicates standard power armor weight distribution, but the spacing suggests a gait pattern that doesn't match any known Astartes locomotion parameters. Too measured, too precise. It's as if whoever made these prints was walking to a rhythm rather than tactical necessity. They entered the monastery's entrance hall with weapons ready but not raised, the posture of professionals who understood that some threats couldn't be stopped by bolter fire. The hall stretched before them with impossible perspective, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that defied their illumination equipment. Banners hung from the walls in perfect condition, their fabric unmarked by age or battle damage, displaying the Forsaken chapter's heraldry in colors too vivid for cloth that should have been destroyed 17 years ago. But these banners told stories that violated Imperial chronology. Each displayed campaign honors and battle decorations for conflicts that had occurred after the chapter's confirmed extinction. Vex read the Gothic script with growing unease. Cleansing of Vareth Prime, 387 M42, 3 years after the monastery's destruction. Defense of Cardinal's Gate, 391.M42, 7 years post-extinction. The Silent Crusade, 398.M42. A campaign that bore yesterday's date. The footprints continued toward the Reclusiam, Thane observed, his scope tracking the ceramic impressions across the hall's marble floor. Depth analysis suggests the maker was carrying additional weight, possibly ceremonial armor components or ritual implements. The spacing remains consistent, that same metronomic precision. Whoever made these tracks was walking to account a specific numerical sequence. Zephyr 9's mechadendrites writhed as they processed the hall's acoustic properties. Sound propagation anomalies detected. Our footsteps are being amplified and redistributed through the structure's Vox systems. Someone, or something, is listening to our approach and broadcasting it throughout the monastery. The acoustic mapping suggests the structure contains occupied chambers, despite visual evidence of abandonment. The single set of footprints led deeper into the monastery's heart, each impression pressed into marble that should have been rubble. Vex followed the trail with growing certainty that they were walking into a trap designed not to capture them, but to complete them, to make them part of whatever impossibility had preserved this place beyond its death. As they approached the Reclusium's entrance, the monastery's bells began to toll with funeral solemnity. The sound echoed through passages that shouldn't exist, ringing changes that spoke of death and resurrection in tones too pure for bronze that had been destroyed by orbital bombardment. Each bell stroke seemed to count something, marking progress toward a completion that waited in the shadows ahead. The bells had been silenced 17 years ago, their bronze melted by lance fire that had carved through the planet's surface like the Emperor's judgment. Yet here they rang with perfect pitch, their voices joining in a funeral dirge for warriors who refused to stay dead. The funeral bells guided them through corridors that stretched longer than architectural blueprints allowed, their tolling rhythm synchronized with the ceramic footprints that led inexorably toward the Reclusium's heart. Each bell stroke seemed to resonate through Vex's bones, creating harmonics that made her teeth ache and her augmetic eye twitch with involuntary focusing adjustments. The sound carried weight beyond mere bronze and bronze, as if each tone was counting down to something that waited beyond the reach of normal time. The Reclusium's doors stood open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, their carved reliefs depicting the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne with details too precise for human craftsmanship. Vex had seen similar carvings across a dozen shrine worlds, but these moved with subtle animation. The Emperor's eyes tracking their approach, his fingers shifting positions as if blessing or condemning their investigation. The doors themselves bore no battle damage despite orbital bombardment records that showed this chamber receiving direct lance strikes. They crossed the threshold into architectural impossibility. The Reclusium stretched before them in perfect Gothic majesty, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that their illumination equipment couldn't penetrate. But it was the chamber's contents that stopped Vex's breath in her throat and made Thane's auspex emit warning chimes of disbelief. 987 suits of Astartes power armor stood in perfect formation across the chamber's marble floor, arranged in precise tactical squares that spoke of parade ground discipline. Each suit stood empty but erect, their ceramite plates gleaming with maintenance that should have been impossible in an abandoned fortress. The armor pieces showed no battle damage, no wear patterns, no environmental degradation. They appeared freshly blessed and sanctified, as if their wearers had simply stepped out of them moments before. 13 gaps in the formation, Thane reported, his voice carrying the controlled precision of a man cataloguing impossibilities. The missing suits correspond to command positions, chapter master, chaplains, apothecaries, senior sergeants. The absences form a specific pattern, following Codex Astartes' hierarchical deployment structures. Vex moved among the empty suits, her footsteps echoing with unnatural amplification. Each piece of armor bore nameplates etched in fresh Gothic script, the letters bright silver against ceramite that gleamed like polished bone. She read the names with growing unease. Brother Malthius, killed in action during the final assault. Brother Corvin, confirmed dead in the monastery's collapse. Brother Thaddeus, vaporized by lance fire while manning the eastern batteries. These were the names of the dead, warriors whose gene seed had been declared unrecoverable, whose mortal remains had been consumed by orbital fire. Yet their armor stood in formation as if awaiting their return from some temporary deployment. Biosignature analysis complete, Zephyr 9 announced, his mechadendrites writhing with mechanical agitation. Each suit contains a full Astartes life sign profile: heartbeat, respiratory patterns, enhanced metabolic functions, gene seed activity. The readings indicate occupancy despite visual evidence of vacancy. According to my sensors, 987 battle brothers are currently standing at attention in this chamber. The chamber's incense braziers ignited spontaneously as they approached the formation's center, filling the air with sacred smoke that carried the scent of burning bone and blessed promethium. The smell triggered memories of battlefield cremations, of funeral pyres where the honored dead received their final rites before joining the Emperor's light. But underneath the familiar odors, Vex detected something else: the sweet corruption of flesh that had died but refused to decay. The acoustic properties are wrong, Thane observed, his voice carrying strange harmonics as it echoed through the chamber. Our breathing, our heartbeats, even our movements are being amplified and redistributed. The sound patterns suggest we're breathing in rhythm with something else, something that matches the biosignatures Zephyr 9 is detecting. As if summoned by his words, the empty helmets began to turn. The movement was subtle at first, a slight rotation that could have been dismissed as optical illusion or environmental shifting. But gradually, with mechanical precision, each helmet pivoted to track their passage through the formation. 987 empty visors followed their movements with the patient attention of predators, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Vex approached the nearest suit, its nameplate reading, Brother Gaius, 3rd Company, 7th Tactical Squad. The armor showed perfect maintenance despite its wearer's confirmed death during the monastery's final battle. She reached toward the helmet's vox grill, her fingers trembling slightly as they approached the ceramite surface. The moment her gauntlet made contact, warmth pulsed through the armor like a heartbeat. The suit's systems activated with soft chimes and status indicators that painted the helmet's interior with soft green light. Through the vox grill, she heard breathing, slow, measured, the respiratory pattern of an Astartes in meditative trance. Brother Gaius? She whispered. The breathing stopped. For 13 heartbeats, the chamber fell silent, except for the distant tolling of bells that shouldn't exist. Then, from within the empty armor, a voice emerged, not from the vox system, but from the ceramite itself, as if the armor had learned to speak. The counting continues, Inquisitor. We hold our positions as ordered. The enemy advances but never arrives. Our watch is eternal, but eternity grows, complicated. Zephyr 9's auspex erupted in cascading alarm signals as every suit in the formation activated simultaneously. Status lights flickered to life across 987 sets of power armor, their machine spirits awakening to serve masters who existed in states between life and death. The chamber filled with the soft susurrus of breathing patterns, heartbeat monitors, and life support systems, maintaining warriors who cast no shadows and left no thermal signatures. Movement detected in the sub-levels, Thane reported, his long-range scope penetrating the chamber's floor with ground-penetrating radar sweeps. Thermal signature approaching from below. Pattern analysis suggests human enhanced physiology consistent with Astartes modifications. Single target, but the heat signature is inconsistent. It fluctuates between active body temperature and ambient environmental readings. The footprints they had followed ended at the chamber's center, where a 13th set of impressions continued deeper into the monastery's heart. These new tracks pressed into marble with greater depth, suggesting their maker carried additional weight or moved with purpose that transcended normal locomotion. As Vex knelt to examine the fresh impressions, her breath misted in air that had suddenly grown cold despite the incense brazier's warmth. The new footprints were still warm, their ceramic impressions radiating heat that spoke of recent passage. Someone had walked this path minutes, perhaps seconds, before their arrival. The bells continued their funeral toll, but now their rhythm matched the empty suit's breathing patterns, creating a symphony of death and artificial life that resonated through the reclusium's stones. 987 empty helmets watched them with patient attention, waiting for something that approached from the monastery's depths with footsteps that burned warm tracks into cold stone. In the distance, echoing through passages that led toward the fortress's gene seed vaults, they heard the sound of a single voice reciting the litany of the faithful dead, but the words emerged in reverse, as if death itself was being undone through the careful pronunciation of sacred syllables spoken backward. The reversed litany drew them deeper into the monastery's bowels, each backward syllable pulling them towards secrets that should have been consumed by orbital fire 17 years ago. Vex followed the warm footprints through passages that descended below the reclusium's foundation, her augmetic eye adjusting to darkness that seemed to absorb their illumination rather than reflect it. The monastery's crypts waited below, their stone corridors carved from the planet's bedrock with devotional precision that spoke of centuries spent honoring the dead. The walls bore murals that violated Imperial historical records with their impossible narratives. Painted in pigments too fresh for artwork that should have been destroyed, the frescoes depicted the Forsaken chapter's final battle with meticulous detail, but the scenes showed them fighting against Imperial forces rather than the chaos incursion that official reports described. Lance strikes from Imperial Navy vessels rained down upon defending Astartes, while drop pod assaults carried space marines in unfamiliar livery against the monastery's walls. These paintings suggest a different version of events, Thane observed, his scope's recording function capturing images that would require careful analysis by Ordo Malleus xenoarchaeologists. The chapter appears to be defending against Imperial attack rather than chaos corruption. The attacking forces bear no heretical markings, no signs of warp taint or demonic influence. Vex's servo skull projected holographic recordings of the actual battle, pict feeds she had archived during the original investigation 17 years ago. The footage showed the same engagement from orbital reconnaissance platforms, but the details contradicted the mural's narrative. In the official records, the Forsaken chapter fought desperately against tentacled horrors that emerged from warp rifts, their bolters blazing against enemies that defied physical description. The murals showed clean Imperial warfare, precise tactical engagements between loyalist forces. Two different battles, she murmured, studying the contradictions that spoke of either historical revision or temporal displacement. The same coordinates, the same participants, but entirely different wars. Zephyr 9's mechadendrites traced the mural's surfaces, his sensors detecting paint layers that revealed chronological impossibilities. Substrate analysis indicates these pigments were applied recently, within the last solar week, but spectral analysis of the base materials suggests they were mixed using minerals that have been extinct on this world for millennia. The artwork is both ancient and contemporary, existing in temporal superposition. The crypt's central chamber opened before them like a stone flower, its vaulted ceiling supported by pillars carved with the names of every battle brother who had served in the Forsaken chapter across 8 centuries of Imperial service. At the chamber's heart, Chapter Master Korath's sarcophagus stood open and empty, its lid displaced to reveal an interior lined with blessed ceramite and sanctified metals. The sarcophagus should have contained the Chapter Master's remains, preserved in stasis until the Emperor's final triumph called all faithful warriors to his side. Instead, the interior walls were covered in fresh scratches that spelled out coordinates in binary cant, their angular strokes carved with fingernails or ceramite gauntlets. Vex knelt beside the sarcophagus, her fingers tracing the desperate markings while her servo skull translated the numerical sequences into Gothic coordinates. The binary pointed deeper into the fortress, toward the gene seed vault that orbital bombardment had supposedly destroyed along with the chapter's genetic legacy. "The scratches are bleeding," Thane reported with the clinical precision of a man cataloguing horrors that violated natural law. "Fresh hemoglobin emerging from stone that should contain no organic matter. The blood appears to be gene-enhanced, consistent with Astarte's physiology." As they watched, red droplets welled from the carved binary, flowing down the sarcophagus's interior walls with gravitational defiance. The blood moved upward as often as down, tracing patterns that suggested the scratches were wounds inflicted upon the stone itself. Each droplet that fell upward disappeared into shadows that gathered in the chamber's corners despite their illumination equipment's steady output. Vex began reciting protective litanies, the familiar words of the Imperial Creed flowing from her lips with practiced devotion. But as she spoke, the same words echoed from deeper chambers ahead of them. Her own voice, speaking the same prayers with identical inflection and timing. The echo preceded her speech, creating a temporal loop where effect preceded cause in defiance of causality's fundamental laws. "Thermal analysis confirms the source," Zephyr 9 announced, his organic eye wide with technological bewilderment. "The approaching heat signature matches your physiological profile, Castellan. According to my sensors, you are currently located in the gene seed vault, reciting litanies while examining something that generates significant electromagnetic disturbance." The warm footprints continued deeper into the crypts, but now they were joined by two additional sets, impressions that matched Thane's combat boots and Zephyr 9's augmetic locomotion systems. The tracks led toward the gene seed vault with purposeful direction, suggesting their makers knew exactly where they were going and what they would find there. "We're following our own future path," Vex realized, her understanding crystallizing into horror. "Someone is mirroring our investigation from ahead in time, duplicating our movements before we make them. The thermal signature, the voice echoes, the footprints. We're tracking ourselves." The chamber's temperature dropped by 17 degrees in the span of 3 heartbeats, their breath misting as warmth fled toward the vault's deeper levels. The sarcophagus's bleeding scratches began to glow with soft bioluminescence, their binary coordinates pulsing in rhythm with the distant funeral bells that continued their impossible tolling. Each pulse revealed additional markings, coordinates that pointed to sublevels that existed below the vault's documented foundations. Thane's chronometer began running backward again, its display cycling through timestamps that preceded their arrival by hours, then days, then years. "Time distortion increasing," he reported, his voice carrying the strain of a man whose reality was becoming negotiable. "Local temporal flow exhibits severe instability. My equipment suggests we've been in this chamber for 17 years, but my memory indicates we arrived minutes ago." The bleeding coordinates completed their message as the last symbols carved themselves into the stone. Coordinates pointing to the gene seed vault's deepest level, where the chapter's progenoid glands waited in stasis for harvest and cultivation. But the final coordinates included additional data, a count that matched the number of empty armor suits in the reclusium above, 987. The exact number of brothers who had stood ready for battle when orbital bombardment ended their existence. The exact number of biosignatures their sensors detected, despite finding no physical bodies. The exact number of gene seed samples that should have been destroyed, but apparently waited in preservation units that defied their own destruction. As they prepared to descend toward the vault, following footprints that belonged to their future selves, the monastery's bells changed their rhythm. Instead of funeral tolling, they began counting 1, 2, 3, each chime marking progress toward a sum that waited in the darkness below, where the dead kept careful tallies of their own resurrection. The counting reached 13 before starting over, beginning an endless numerical sequence that would continue until all 1,000 brothers had been properly accounted for in whatever ledger the Forsaken chapter maintained beyond the reach of death. The counting bells guided them through maintenance passages, that led toward the gene seed vault, their numerical sequence creating a rhythm that synchronized with the warm footprints they followed through corridors that pulsed with a faint heartbeat. The monastery's internal structure had changed since the architectural surveys 17 years ago. Passages connected to chambers that shouldn't exist according to Imperial blueprints, creating a labyrinthine network that defied the original Gothic design principles. Vex felt the wrongness in the walls themselves as they descended. The rockcrete surfaces bore a subtle organic quality, their texture shifting between stone and something more yielding when observed peripherally. Her augmetic eye detected microscopic movements in the wall matrices, as if the monastery's structure was slowly transforming from architectural to biological, replacing dead stone with living tissue that maintained the appearance of imperial construction. Atmospheric composition changing, Zephyr 9 reported, his olfactory sensors detecting trace elements that shouldn't exist in recycled air systems. Elevated oxygen content suggests active photosynthesis, but there are no plant life forms present. The air contains organic compounds consistent with human respiratory byproducts. Carbon dioxide exhaled by approximately 1,000 individuals breathing in synchronized patterns. They passed through a maintenance junction where the heartbeat became audible, a steady pulse that resonated through the corridor walls with the deep rhythm of enhanced Astartes cardiovascular systems. The sound came from all directions simultaneously, as if the monastery itself had developed circulatory networks that pumped vital fluids through passages designed for human passage. The first physical manifestation waited in a side chamber, standing motionless beside a tactical cogitator bank that displayed star charts from campaigns the Forsaken chapter had never fought. The figure wore complete Astartes power armor in the chapter's colors, his ceramite plates bearing fresh battle honors and purity seals that gleamed with recent blessing. But when Vex approached, her auspex detected no life signs, no thermal emissions, no electromagnetic signatures from his armor's power systems. Brother Maltheus, she read from the nameplate etched across his breastplate. Third Company, confirmed killed in action during the monastery's final assault. The armor stood in perfect condition despite its wearer's documented death, each plate properly maintained and sanctified according to codex requirements. The figure's helmet displayed active vox runes, their soft green glow indicating operational communication systems. But when Thane removed the helmet with careful reverence, they found the armor completely hollow. No skeleton, no organic remains, no trace of the warrior who should have occupied the ceramite shell. Instead, a faint luminescent mist swirled within the empty space, forming patterns that suggested human outline before dissolving into ethereal wisps. The counting hasn't finished, the hollow armor spoke, its voice emerging from the luminescent mist with Chapter Master Korath's familiar tones. We hold our positions as ordered, but the enemy refuses to advance to their designated coordinates. The battle plan requires their participation, and they have failed to arrive for 17 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Vex studied the tactical displays surrounding the Hollow Brother, their screens showing battle scenarios that repeated in endless loops. Each scenario depicted the same engagement: the Forsaken chapter's defense of the monastery against chaos forces that attacked in identical patterns, wave after wave of tentacled horrors emerging from warp rifts that opened at precise temporal intervals. But in each iteration, the chapter's defensive positions grew stronger, their tactics more refined, their victory more complete. We learn from each cycle, the hollow armor continued, its luminescent occupants swirling with patterns that suggested deep contemplation. The enemy's approach vectors, their weapon capabilities, their tactical preferences. Each defeat teaches us something new, and we incorporate those lessons into our next defensive deployment. Soon, we will achieve perfect victory. Zephyr 9's cogitator systems began displaying countdown sequences in languages that predated Imperial Gothic, their symbols flowing across his display screens in patterns that hurt to observe directly. External data intrusion detected, he announced, his vox grill crackling with static interference. Something is uploading information directly into my memory banks. Tactical data, battle plans, genetic profiles. The data suggests preparation for an engagement that has been planned for 17 years. The hollow armor approached Thane with measured steps, its empty interior casting shadows that moved independently of the figure's locomotion. "Your chronometer interests us," it said, gesturing toward the timepiece that continued its backward progression through temporal coordinates. "Time moves strangely in this place. We have discovered that victory requires proper timing, precise coordination between cause and effect. Your device suggests you understand temporal manipulation." Thane's chronometer now displayed dates from various points in Imperial history, its display cycling through timestamps that suggested the device was receiving signals from multiple temporal sources simultaneously. The hollow armor touched the chronometer's surface with gauntlets that should have contained hands, and fresh coordinates appeared on its display, coordinates pointing deeper into the vault system, toward chambers that existed below the documented foundation levels. 986 brothers wait in the deep chambers, the hollow armor explained, its luminescent occupant brightening with what might have been anticipation. Each maintains his position in the Great Formation, preparing for the final muster when all 1,000 will march again. But the counting requires completion, and completion requires contribution. The walls around them began displaying fresh scratches, coordinates carved by invisible hands that pointed toward the gene seed vault's sub-levels. Each marking appeared with the sound of ceramite against stone, as if the monastery's structure was being modified by warriors who existed in states between death and resurrection. The scratches formed patterns that Vex recognized from Ordo Malleus xenoarchaeological texts, summoning configurations used to anchor warp entities in real space using genetic material as binding agents. "The vault awaits," the hollow armor announced, turning toward passages that led deeper into the monastery's transformed architecture. "The final 13 coordinates require specification, and you carry the necessary authorization codes. Your arrival completes the preparation phase. The counting can finally reach its conclusion." As they followed the hollow brother toward the gene seed vault, Vex noticed that the warm footprints they had been tracking were joined by additional impressions, ceramite bootprints that matched the hollow armor's locomotion pattern. The trail now showed multiple figures moving toward the same destination, all following the same path toward whatever waited in the vault's deepest chambers. Behind them, the monastery's bells continued their numerical progression, each chime marking another step toward completion of a count that had been running for 17 years. The rhythm suggested patience wearing thin, as if the dead grew tired of waiting for their resurrection to achieve the perfection that would allow them to truly live again. The hollow armor's luminescent occupant pulsed with each bell stroke, its ethereal form growing more solid as they approached the vault, as if proximity to the chapter's genetic legacy was allowing the dead to reclaim their physical existence through sheer determination and careful accounting. The gene seed vault's blast doors stood open in defiance of every security protocol Vex had memorized during 3 decades of inquisitorial service. The massive adamantine barriers, each weighing several tons and secured by 17 different locking mechanisms, gaped like a wound in the monastery's deepest level. Her servo-skull's analysis confirmed the impossible. Every lock showed secure status on their display panels, their machine spirits insisting the doors remained sealed even as the team walked through the breach that shouldn't exist. Inside, the vault defied the destruction she had personally authorized. Where orbital bombardment should have left molten slag and twisted metal, she found the chapter's genetic legacy preserved in pristine condition. But the gene seed containers weren't arranged according to Codex protocols. Instead, they floated several inches above their storage shelves, rotating slowly in complex geometric patterns that created harmonics in the vault's recycled atmosphere. Each container pulsed with soft bioluminescence, their contents glowing through reinforced ceramite, as if the genetic material within had achieved some form of consciousness. The rotation created a low humming sound, that resonated through Vex's bones, a frequency that seemed to call to something deep in her own genetic structure. Her enhanced physiology responded to the harmonic, her heartbeat synchronizing with the container's pulsing rhythm, despite her efforts to maintain physiological independence. "Impossible geometric configuration," Zephyr 9 announced, his mechadendrites writhing as they attempted to map the floating container's arrangement. The pattern matches summoning configurations detailed in classified Ordo Malleus texts, specifically protocols for anchoring warp entities in real space using genetic material as binding agents. But this configuration is far more sophisticated than any recorded example. The Vault's servitor tenders continued their maintenance routines with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized to the gene seed rotation despite having been dead for 17 years. Vex watched them perform cleaning protocols and temperature adjustments on floating containers, their augmetic systems somehow interfacing with genetic material that no longer obeyed normal physical laws. The servitor's organic components had long since decomposed, leaving only mechanical skeletons that maintained their programming through sheer devotional persistence. "The harmonic frequency is affecting my chronometer," Thane reported, his timepiece now displaying multiple temporal readings simultaneously. "Local time stream exhibits severe instability. According to these readings, we arrived here yesterday, are currently arriving now, and will arrive tomorrow." The gene seed appears to be generating temporal distortion fields that allow multiple timeline states to coexist. When Thane attempted to break the pattern by grasping one of the floating containers, his hands passed through the ceramite as if it existed in a parallel dimension. But his genetic material responded to proximity with the gene seed. His enhanced physiology began manifesting changes that spoke of direct biological communication. His muscle density increased noticeably, his reflexes sharpened to Astartes levels, and his eyes developed the enhanced visual acuity that marked space marine modifications. "The containers are selectively corporeal," he observed, his voice deepening as his larynx restructured itself to accommodate enhanced lung capacity. "They exist in physical space only when interacting with compatible genetic material. My proximity is triggering adaptive responses in both the gene seed and my own biology." Zephyr 9's sensors detected massive biological activity beneath the Vault's foundation. Something was growing in chambers that existed below even the deepest documented levels. The activity patterns suggested cultivation processes far more complex than standard gene seed preparation, involving genetic manipulation techniques that violated both imperial doctrine and biological possibility. The hollow armor that had guided them spoke from the Vault's entrance, its luminescent occupant now bright enough to cast shadows on the walls. "The final muster requires proper genetic foundation," it explained, gesturing toward the floating containers with gauntlets that flickered between solid and ethereal states. "Each brother needs his progenoid legacy, but the resurrection process demands enhancement. Pure gene seed provides the template, but completion requires additional genetic data." As if summoned by these words, 12 additional hollow armors entered the vault, their ceramite plates bearing the insignia of the chapter's command structure: chaplains, apothecaries, librarians, and senior sergeants. Each contained the same luminescent mist as their guide, but their occupants pulsed with different harmonics, creating a symphony of resurrection frequencies that made the gene seed containers spin faster in their geometric formation. Chapter Master Korath's voice emerged from the largest hollow armor, his tones carrying the authority of a warrior who had commanded 1,000 brothers in life and continued that command beyond death. 17 years we have waited for investigators with proper genetic authorization codes. Inquisitorial physiology provides the necessary enhancement template for our resurrection. Your genetic material will complete the final cultivation sequence. Vex realized the true purpose of the floating gene seed configuration. It wasn't preserving the chapter's genetic legacy, but preparing to harvest genetic material from anyone who entered the vault. The harmonic frequencies were scanning their biological structures, analyzing their enhanced physiology, and incorporating that data into the resurrection matrix. Each investigative team that had responded to the impossible transmissions had become raw material for the chapter's return to physical existence. The Vault's central processor, a massive brain-like organ that shouldn't have existed in any Imperial facility, pulsed with bioluminescent activity as it displayed tactical data from battles that hadn't occurred yet. The organ was using the accumulated genetic information to calculate future engagements, predicting enemy movements based on enhanced reaction times and strategic capabilities that exceeded baseline human limitations. We learn from each investigative team, Chapter Master Korath explained, his hollow armor approaching with measured steps that left no footprints on the Vault's floor. Inquisitorial training, guard tactical doctrine, Mechanicus technical expertise, Astartes combat conditioning. Each genetic sample provides new capabilities that we incorporate into our resurrection template. Soon, we will possess the combined knowledge and abilities of everyone who has attempted to solve the mystery of our survival. The gene seed containers began descending toward their shelves, but instead of settling into their storage positions, they opened like flowering buds to reveal contents that defied biological classification. Inside each container, genetic materials swirled in patterns that suggested conscious intelligence, forming temporary structures that resembled organs, limbs, and neural networks before dissolving back into undifferentiated biomatter. The cultivation process was beginning, and Vex realized that her team's investigation had been designed from the start to provide the final genetic components needed for the Forsaken Chapter's true resurrection, not as they had been, but as something that incorporated the best traits of everyone who had tried to understand their impossible survival. The Hollow Brothers began to circle the Vault's perimeter, their luminescent occupants growing brighter as the gene seed responded to proximity with compatible genetic material, preparing to harvest what they needed to finally complete their 17-year count toward perfect, eternal victory. The Vault's floor began to vibrate with seismic activity that had nothing to do with planetary tectonics. Beneath their feet, massive biological processes churned with the rhythm of organ systems that operated on an inhuman scale. Vex activated her servo-skull's ground-penetrating sensors, and the readings that emerged painted a picture of horror that violated every principle of Imperial biology. The monastery's sublevels had been converted into a vast organic manufacturing facility that stretched kilometers into the planet's crust. Arterial networks pulsed through walls of living tissue, their crimson contents flowing in patterns that suggested circulatory systems designed by an intelligence that understood flesh as architecture. The air thrummed with the sound of massive heartbeat machinery, each pulse synchronized with the gene seed container's rotation above. Fabrication alcoves detected, Zephyr 9 reported, his sensors mapping chambers that existed in impossible proximity to their current position. Approximately 1,000 cultivation units, each containing partially developed humanoid forms. Genetic analysis suggests Astartes physiology, but the development patterns violate all known gene seed protocols. Through maintenance shafts that opened at the Hollow Brothers' touch, they descended into the source of the biological activity. The fabrication chamber stretched before them like a cathedral of flesh, its vaulted ceiling supported by pillars of living bone that pulsed with visible circulation networks. Walls of arterial tissue lined the chamber, their surfaces studded with alcoves that contained the growing forms of space marines in various stages of development. But these weren't normal gene seed cultivation processes. The bodies being assembled in the alcoves bore features from multiple sources, faces that combined traits from different genetic lineages, musculature that exhibited enhancement patterns from various Imperial organizations, bone structures that suggested hybrid development between human and post-human physiologies. Each alcove contained a chimeric warrior that incorporated genetic material from the investigators who had attempted to solve the chapter's mystery across 17 years of impossible survival. Vex recognized her own facial features in alcove 847, the developing body wearing inquisitorial regalia she had never owned. The figure's eyes held her memories, its hands bore her scars, but its enhanced physiology exceeded anything achieved through standard inquisitorial augmentation. Nearby alcoves contained bodies with Thane's tactical knowledge written into their neural development, warriors who possessed Zephyr 9's technical expertise encoded in their genetic structure. The resurrection process incorporates investigative experience, Chapter Master Korath explained, his hollow armor now manifesting solid components as proximity to the genetic material allowed his luminescent occupant to reclaim physical form. Each team that responds to our transmissions provides new capabilities, new knowledge, new tactical advantages. We have learned from Imperial Guard regiments, Mechanicus explorator fleets, Astartes strike forces, even inquisitorial investigation protocols. The facility's central processor, the massive brain organ Vex had glimpsed in the vault, dominated the chamber's heart with neural complexity that hurt to observe directly. Its surface crawled with synaptic activity that created patterns of light and shadow, displaying tactical scenarios that incorporated knowledge from multiple Imperial organizations. The organ was using accumulated genetic information to calculate optimal combat strategies, predicting enemy movements based on enhanced capabilities that no single Imperial force possessed. Temporal combat analysis. The brain organ's surface displayed in Gothic script that formed from neural firing patterns. Enemy response vectors calculated using 17 years of investigative data. Victory probability, 97.4%. Genetic harvest completion required for implementation phase. Some alcoves contained bodies that wore Imperial Guard uniforms, their developing physiology enhanced with Astartes gene seed modifications. Others bore Mechanicus robes, their organic components augmented with biological equivalents of mechadendrite systems. The facility was creating warriors that combined the best aspects of every Imperial organization, using genetic material harvested from investigators across nearly 2 decades of impossible transmissions. Vex approached Alcove 991, where a body with Thane's facial features wore inquisitorial regalia that belonged to her current rank and position. The figure's development was nearly complete, its enhanced physiology ready for activation. Inside the alcove's amniotic fluid, she could see the warrior's eyes moving beneath closed lids, as if dreaming of battles that incorporated tactical knowledge from both their genetic sources. The final cultivation sequence requires conscious participation, Chapter Master Korath announced, his form now solid enough to cast shadows on the facility's organic walls. Your genetic templates must be willingly integrated to complete the resurrection matrix. We offer you the chance to join our eternal service, to become part of a force that combines the Emperor's finest warriors with the tactical expertise of his most dedicated servants. The facility's cultivation alcoves began opening simultaneously, releasing amniotic fluids that carried the scent of enhancement serums and genetic manipulation chemicals. The nearly complete warriors inside began showing signs of consciousness, fingers twitching, enhanced hearts beginning their first beats, gene-enhanced lungs drawing their first breaths of recycled air. But these resurrected brothers retained perfect memories from their genetic sources. Warriors with Vex's strategic training moved with her tactical preferences, while figures bearing Thane's investigative experience approached problems with his methodical precision. The facility had created an army that possessed not just the Forsaken chapter's original capabilities, but the accumulated expertise of everyone who had tried to understand their survival. "We are more than we were," the awakening warriors spoke in unison, their voices blending the tones of their original brothers with those of their genetic donors. Each investigation has made us stronger, more capable, more prepared for the Emperor's final battle. The enemy will face not just the Forsaken chapter, but the combined might of every Imperial force that has contributed to our resurrection. The hollow chapter master began incorporating into his new body, his ceramite armor fusing with reborn flesh while maintaining his temporal displacement abilities. Around him, His brothers underwent the same transformation, their luminescent occupants settling into physical forms that exceeded their original capabilities through careful genetic integration. The facility's brain organ pulsed with anticipation as the resurrection process approached completion, its neural networks calculating deployment strategies that would utilize the chapter's enhanced abilities to achieve victories that had been impossible during their original existence. The 17-year count was nearly finished, and the final muster would begin with capabilities that no enemy could anticipate or counter. Vex drew her bolt pistol and fired directly into the facility's central brain organ, the blessed rounds detonating against neural tissue that should have been vulnerable to sanctified ammunition. Instead, the explosions phased through the massive processor without effect, their energy dissipating into dimensional spaces that existed parallel to normal reality. The brain organ continued its calculations uninterrupted, its synaptic patterns displaying tactical scenarios that incorporated her own attack patterns into their strategic database. Physical force cannot affect us while we exist in temporal displacement, Chapter Master Korath explained, his newly solid form flickering between corporeal and ethereal states. We learned this lesson during our original death. Conventional weapons fire through us like light through shadow, but each attack you make provides valuable data about Imperial combat doctrine, which we incorporate into our resurrection matrix. The facility's brain organ projected holographic battle scenarios around them, three-dimensional displays that showed the same chaos incursion repeating with subtle variations. In each iteration, the Forsaken chapter's defensive positions grew more sophisticated, their tactics more refined, their victory more complete. Vex recognized her own strategic approaches being employed by the resurrected brothers, her tactical training seamlessly integrated into their combat protocols. Loop iteration 4847, the brain organ displayed in neural fire patterns. Battle commenced, 17 years, 4 months, 16 days ago. Defensive improvements, 3,291. Victory probability increase, 0.003% per iteration. Current tactical efficiency, 97.4% optimal. Genetic integration required for perfection achievement. Recent loop variations showed the chapter fighting the same battle while utilizing equipment and tactics from their future investigators. Warriors wielded weapons that combined bolter technology with Imperial Guard artillery patterns, while tactical squads deployed using strategies that incorporated inquisitorial investigation techniques. Each investigative team had unknowingly provided lessons that improved the chapter's performance in their eternal replay of their final battle. Thane attempted to activate his orbital bombardment beacon, but the signal reached the eternal vigil through temporal distortion fields that displaced it 17 years into the past. The ship's cogitators received the bombardment request during the original assault, creating a causal paradox where the vessel's lance batteries fired on coordinates they wouldn't discover until decades later. The bombardment that had supposedly destroyed the monastery became part of the loop itself, providing the chapter with detailed knowledge of Imperial Navy tactics. Each investigative protocol becomes part of our experience, the newly corporeal chapter master continued, his armor now fully integrated with enhanced flesh that bore genetic memories from multiple sources. Your orbital bombardment authorization taught us Imperial Navy strike patterns. Previous investigation teams provided Guard tactical doctrine, Mechanicus technical expertise, even Xenos combat data from Ordo Xenos operations. Zephyr 9 attempted to sever the facility's power systems, but his mechadendrites passed through control interfaces that existed in quantum superposition. Temporal anchor analysis complete, he reported, his organic components showing signs of genetic modification from proximity to the cultivation alcoves. The facility's existence is maintained by the observers themselves. Each investigative team becomes part of the loop's power, or source, their life energy feeding the resurrection process. The cultivation alcoves cracked open simultaneously, disgorging 1,000 chimeric Astartes, whose genetic composition incorporated traits from multiple Imperial sources. These resurrected brothers moved with unnaturally perfect coordination, their enhanced physiology exceeding standard Astartes capabilities through careful integration of investigative team genetic material. They spoke in unison with voices that blended their original tones with those of their genetic donors. "We are the sum of our investigations," they declared, their words creating harmonics that resonated through the facility's organic architecture. "Every team that sought to understand our survival has become part of our resurrection. We possess inquisitorial authority, guard tactical training, mechanicus technical knowledge, Astartes combat conditioning. The Emperor's enemies will face the combined expertise of his most loyal servants." The resurrected brothers demonstrated impossible capabilities as they began their final preparations. They could phase through attacks they had experienced in previous loops, while their weapons fired bolter rounds that impacted targets before being triggered. Some warriors displayed prescient awareness of enemy movements, dodging attacks that hadn't been launched yet, based on tactical knowledge accumulated across multiple timeline iterations. Temporal combat protocols engaged, the facility's brain organ announced, its neural networks displaying deployment strategies that utilize 17 years of accumulated tactical data. Enemy response patterns catalogued, victory conditions optimized, genetic integration at 99.7% completion, final harvest sequence initiated. The resurrected chapter began systematically surrounding Vex's team, but their approach patterns incorporated investigation techniques that the team had used during their descent into the monastery. Each brother moved with tactical knowledge that belonged to Imperial forces, their enhanced capabilities allowing them to predict and counter standard Imperial responses based on genetic memories they had absorbed from previous investigative teams. Vex realized the true scope of the chapter's temporal trap. Every response to their impossible transmissions had been designed to provide genetic material and tactical knowledge that would enhance their resurrection. The monastery's survival wasn't miraculous. It was carefully orchestrated to lure Imperial forces into contributing to their own defeat through willing participation in the investigation process. The loop serves multiple purposes, Chapter Master Korath revealed, his enhanced form now radiating temporal energy that distorted space around him. We perfect our combat capabilities while harvesting genetic improvements from the Emperor's finest servants. Each iteration makes us stronger, more capable, more prepared for our true mission. The facility's brain organ began displaying tactical scenarios that extended far beyond the monastery's defense. The resurrected chapter's true goal wasn't just survival. They planned to use their accumulated temporal knowledge and genetic enhancements to retroactively prevent their original extinction, creating a paradox that would allow them to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. As the final harvest sequence began, the cultivation alcoves released genetic extraction tendrils that reached toward the investigation team with impossible precision, guided by 17 years of accumulated knowledge about Imperial investigative protocols and defensive responses. The genetic extraction tendrils moved with surgical precision, but their approach triggered something unexpected in the facility's carefully orchestrated resurrection sequence. Each death created temporal echoes that rippled through the cultivation matrix, causing the victims to continue existing as memory ghosts within the chapter's collective consciousness. Vex watched in horror as Thane's body crumpled beneath the tendrils' embrace, his genetic material flowing toward the cultivation alcoves, while his consciousness simultaneously observed his own death from the perspective of his killer. "I can see through his eyes," Thane's voice emerged from the resurrected brother who had absorbed his genetic memories, speaking with perfect inflection, while his original body lay cooling on the facility's organic floor. "My tactical knowledge, my investigative experience, my memory of every heretic I've interrogated, it's all here, preserved in his neural matrix. I'm dying and living simultaneously." The facility's brain organ pulsed with increased activity as it processed the temporal paradox created by consciousness existing in multiple states. Neural patterns cascaded across its surface, displaying calculations that tried to reconcile the existence of memories within both dead and living hosts. The organ's synaptic activity suggested confusion, as if the resurrection process had encountered an unexpected variable in its 17-year optimization sequence. Zephyr 9's mechanical components began shutting down as genetic extraction drained his biological elements, but his uploaded consciousness found itself distributed across multiple resurrected brothers who had incorporated his technical expertise. Fascinating, his voice emerged from 3 different warriors simultaneously, their mechadendrite-enhanced forms speaking in perfect unison. I exist in parallel processing states. My death has become a form of multiplication rather than termination. Vex realized the chapter's resurrection wasn't just tactical. They had become temporal parasites, feeding on the chronological energy of their investigators to sustain their existence outside linear time flow. Each investigative team didn't just provide genetic material. They became part of a vast consciousness matrix that allowed the chapter to access memories and experiences across multiple timeline iterations. The monastery's structure began shifting to accommodate multiple versions of reality simultaneously. Corridors connected moments from different loops, allowing the resurrected brothers to access resources from past and future investigations. Vex walked through passages where she could observe herself arriving 17 years ago, investigating last week, and dying tomorrow, all occurring in the same architectural space through temporal superposition. We have learned to exist in all moments at once, Chapter Master Korath explained, his enhanced form now radiating temporal energy that created visible distortions in local space-time. Death taught us that linear existence is a limitation. By incorporating the memories of our investigators, we achieve perspective across multiple timelines, multiple possibilities, multiple victories. The brain organ's displays revealed the true scope of their temporal manipulation. The Forsaken chapter hadn't been trapped in a death loop. They had deliberately created a resurrection engine that used investigative teams as temporal anchors, allowing them to exist in the spaces between cause and effect, where conventional laws of physics became negotiable. Each investigation team becomes a chronological power source, the organ's neural patterns spelled out in Gothic fire. Their life energy, their memories, their genetic potential, all converted into temporal stability that allows us to operate outside normal causality. We exist because they seek to understand our existence. Through the memory matrix, Vex experienced flashes of previous investigative teams, Imperial Guard regiments, whose tactical knowledge now resided in resurrected brothers, Mechanicus explorator fleets, whose technical expertise enhanced the chapter's equipment. Even Astartes, strike forces whose combat experience had been absorbed into the collective consciousness. 17 years of Imperial forces had contributed to the resurrection, each team believing they were the first to respond to the impossible transmissions. The facility began manifesting multiple timeline versions simultaneously as the resurrection process approached completion. Investigators arrived, were incorporated, and resisted across dozens of temporal layers, their experiences feeding into a vast calculation engine that optimized the chapter's capabilities across all possible combat scenarios. The temporal crusade begins now, Chapter Master Korath announced, his form beginning to phase between different timeline states. We will use our accumulated knowledge to prevent our original destruction, retroactively altering Imperial history to ensure our survival. The Horus Heresy, the failed campaigns, the lost worlds, all can be corrected through careful application of foreknowledge. The resurrected brothers began departing through temporal rifts that opened in the facilities. Walls, their enhanced forms stepping into different points in Imperial history, with tactical knowledge that would allow them to achieve victories that had been impossible during their original existence. Warriors carrying Vex's strategic training materialized during ancient battles, while figures bearing Thane's investigative expertise appeared at crucial moments in Imperial intelligence operations. But Vex's consciousness, now existing as a memory ghost within the chapter's collective matrix, began to understand the true horror of their temporal crusade. Each historical alteration would create cascading changes that would unmake current reality, replacing the imperfect but genuine Imperium with an optimized version that existed only through the chapter's temporal manipulation. As she watched her own body being processed by the cultivation alcoves, her genetic material prepared for integration into the final resurrected brothers, Vex realized she retained one advantage the chapter hadn't anticipated. Her inquisitorial conditioning allowed her to maintain individual identity within the collective consciousness, creating an internal resistance that the resurrection matrix couldn't fully integrate. From within the memory matrix, she could observe all timeline variations simultaneously, seeing thousands of investigation teams across multiple centuries following identical patterns that fed the chapter's temporal existence. But she also saw the spaces between those patterns, the moments where the temporal engine's calculations became uncertain, where individual will could still assert itself against the collective optimization. The counting that had begun 17 years ago was nearly complete, but the final number required one more component: willing acceptance from an investigator who understood the full scope of the temporal paradox and chose to participate rather than resist. The chapter needed her conscious cooperation to complete their resurrection, and that need gave her the leverage to influence their temporal calculations from within their own collective consciousness. The memory matrix awaited her decision. 17 years of accumulated temporal energy poised to reshape Imperial history, according to calculations that promised perfection at the cost of authentic existence. Within the memory matrix, Vex discovered she wasn't alone. The incorporated investigators formed a secondary consciousness that existed parallel to the original Forsaken brothers, creating an internal war between the chapter's original identity and their accumulated victims. Thousands of Imperial servants who had responded to impossible transmissions across 17 years maintained fragments of their individual awareness, their resistance creating computational friction within the temporal engine's calculations. "We remember who we were," whispered the collective voice of absorbed guard officers, their tactical knowledge creating strategic discord within the resurrection matrix. The chapter promises perfection, but perfection requires the elimination of everything that makes us human: our flaws, our doubts, our capacity for growth through failure. Vex coordinated with other incorporated inquisitors, their combined authority creating pockets of resistance within the collective consciousness. Through shared memories, she experienced their investigations. Inquisitor Valdris, who had responded to the first transmission 16 years ago. Inquisitor Corvin, whose team had been absorbed during the 7th iteration. Dozens of others who had arrived with identical convictions that they were the first to discover the chapter's impossible survival. "The temporal loop isn't random," Inquisitor Valdris's memory ghost explained, his consciousness flickering between individual identity and collective integration. "Each iteration is carefully calculated to provide specific improvements to the resurrection matrix. The chapter learned from my orbital bombardment protocols, then used that knowledge to optimize their defenses against future bombardments." Through the memory matrix, Vex observed the chapter's true history unfolding across multiple timeline layers. They hadn't been destroyed by chaos incursion. They had been eliminated by their own temporal experiments, genetic modifications designed to ensure victory in their campaigns by accessing knowledge from future battles. Their gene seed had become contaminated with chronological energy, trapping them in a recursive death loop where each defeat taught them how to prevent the next iteration's failure. "We sought to become perfect warriors," Chapter Master Korath's original consciousness admitted, his memory existing separately from his resurrected form. The temporal modifications allowed us to experience defeat and victory simultaneously, learning from battles that hadn't occurred yet. But the process corrupted our existence, trapping us between life and death, until we could achieve perfection through accumulated knowledge. The incorporated investigators began revealing the chapter's greatest fear through their shared resistance. If the chapter successfully prevented their original destruction through temporal intervention, the paradox would unmake their current existence, trapping them in true death rather than their current state of recursive resurrection. Their temporal crusade was actually a desperate attempt to escape the death loop by rewriting their fate, but success would eliminate the very conditions that allowed their survival. They're afraid of their own victory, Vex realized, her understanding crystallizing through connection with the other memory ghosts. The temporal modifications that allow them to exist outside normal causality depend on their status as casualties of their original battle. If they prevent that battle, they cease to exist in any form. The facility's brain organ detected the growing resistance within the memory matrix, its neural patterns displaying alarm configurations as the incorporated investigators began coordinating their opposition. Internal conflict detected, it announced through synaptic firewriting. Incorporated consciousness matrix exhibiting unauthorized autonomy. Collective optimization protocols compromised. The resurrected brothers attempting to deploy through temporal rifts found their passage blocked by the memory ghost's resistance. Each historical intervention required conscious cooperation from the incorporated investigators, whose memories provided the tactical knowledge necessary for the temporal alterations. Without willing participation from their victims, the chapter couldn't access the strategic expertise they needed to change Imperial history. "You cannot compel us to cooperate," Vex declared, her consciousness amplified by connection with thousands of other memory ghosts. "Your temporal crusade requires our consent, our willingness to see current reality unmade in favor of your optimized timeline. But we choose to preserve an imperfect existence rather than accept perfect emptiness." The brain organ's calculations became increasingly chaotic as the internal conflict spread through the collective consciousness. Neural networks designed to optimize tactical scenarios began processing contradictory data as the incorporated investigators fed false information into the matrix, creating strategic confusion that prevented the chapter from implementing their historical interventions. Chapter Master Korath's resurrected form materialized within the memory matrix, his enhanced physiology allowing him to exist simultaneously in physical and mental spaces. "You don't understand the scope of our mission," he insisted, his temporal energy creating visible distortions in the consciousness space around them. "We can prevent the Horus heresy, eliminate the Long War, ensure humanity's victory over every threat that has ever challenged the Emperor's vision." "At the cost of everyone who exists now," Vex countered, her inquisitorial authority creating stability fields within the chaotic memory matrix. "Your perfect timeline requires the elimination of current reality. Every Imperial citizen, every loyal servant, every world that has survived through struggle and sacrifice, all a race to create a universe where victory came without cost." The incorporated investigators began sharing their memories of Imperial heroism achieved through imperfection. Guard regiments who won impossible battles through desperate courage rather than tactical optimization. Astartes who achieved victory through brotherhood and sacrifice rather than strategic superiority. Ordinary citizens who maintained faith despite overwhelming odds. Their collective testimony created a counter-narrative within the Matrix that celebrated the value of struggling for victory rather than having it guaranteed through temporal manipulation. "Some realities are worth preserving despite their flaws," Vex declared, her consciousness now serving as a focal point for the memory ghost's resistance. "The Imperium's greatest strength isn't its perfection, it's its capacity to endure and grow stronger through adversity. Your optimized timeline would eliminate that strength by removing the challenges that forge it." The brain organ began displaying cascade failure warnings as the internal conflict reached critical levels. The temporal engine required unanimous cooperation from the incorporated investigators to implement historical changes, but their coordinated resistance was creating computational paradoxes that threatened the entire resurrection matrix. Through the chaos of competing consciousnesses, Vex began to understand the facility's true vulnerability. The chapter's existence depended on the temporal loop created by their investigator's curiosity. If she could convince the memory ghost to stop seeking solutions to the chapter's survival, to accept the mystery as unsolvable, the investigative energy that powered their resurrection would dissipate, returning them to their original state of true death. The greatest weapon against the Forsaken chapter wasn't superior firepower or tactical brilliance. It was the willingness to let some mysteries remain unsolved, to accept that not every impossible transmission required investigation, not every temporal paradox demanded resolution. Vex attempted to sever the investigative energy that powered the chapter's existence by convincing the memory ghosts to abandon their curiosity about the temporal paradox. But the facility's brain organ had anticipated this strategy. As the incorporated investigators began withdrawing their investigative focus, the neural networks compensated by creating alternate timeline branches where their curiosity remained intact, generating parallel versions of reality where the questions continued to demand answers. Curiosity quantum superposition achieved, the brain organ announced through cascading neural fire patterns. Investigative energy maintained through probability multiplication. Each attempt to solve mystery creates mirror reality where mystery remains unsolved. Both states exist simultaneously, providing continuous power source. The memory matrix began fragmenting into multiple consciousness layers, each representing a different investigative outcome. In one layer, Vex successfully convinced the ghosts to abandon their investigation, but that victory existed alongside parallel layers where she failed, where she never arrived, where she cooperated willingly with the resurrection process. The chapter had learned to exist in quantum superposition, drawing power from all possible investigative outcomes simultaneously. Through the fragmenting consciousness, Vex observed the broader pattern that terrified her with its scope. The Forsaken chapter's resurrection had become a viral timeline infection, spreading to other, extinct chapters across Imperial space by sharing their temporal techniques through warp transmission networks. Dead Astartes formations throughout the galaxy were beginning to manifest using identical resurrection protocols, each drawing investigative teams into their own temporal loops. Replication successful, the brain organ displayed as it processed reports from 17 different sectors. Howling Griffins, chapter. Responding to temporal resurrection protocols. Flame Eagles initiating investigative lure transmissions. Firehawks implementing genetic harvest procedures. Viral expansion rate, 347% per standard year. Each newly resurrected chapter began hunting down their own investigators, creating recursive loops of investigation and incorporation that spread across the Imperium like a plague of impossible survival. The Eternal Vigil received simultaneous distress calls from multiple time streams, all describing the same phenomenon. Extinct chapters, broadcasting impossible transmissions that lured Imperial forces into temporal traps designed to harvest their genetic material and tactical knowledge. The infection spreads through investigation itself, Vex realized, watching through the memory matrix as Imperial forces across the galaxy responded to transmissions that shouldn't exist. Every attempt to understand the phenomenon creates new instances of the phenomenon. Curiosity becomes the vector for its own destruction. The hollow chapter master materialized within the fragmenting consciousness, his form now stable enough to interact directly with the memory ghosts while maintaining his temporal displacement abilities. "You understand our true gift to the Imperium," he declared, his voice creating harmonics that resonated through multiple consciousness layers simultaneously. "We offer eternal service, perfect loyalty, optimal tactical capabilities. Death becomes merely another form of deployment." But the viral spread was revealing the chapter's fundamental weakness. Each new resurrection required perfect replication of the original temporal conditions, but the expanding network was creating quantum interference patterns that destabilized the overall matrix. Too many extinct chapters, drawing investigative energy from the same temporal sources, was causing cascade failures in the resurrection calculations. System overload detected, the brain organ reported, its neural patterns now displaying warnings in 17 different languages as it struggled to process the expanding network's computational demands. Temporal anchor saturation approaching critical threshold. Investigative energy distribution insufficient for current resurrection load. Vex began coordinating the memory ghosts to exploit this weakness by amplifying the quantum interference rather than trying to escape it. Instead of withdrawing their investigative energy, she convinced them to focus that energy in directions that created maximum computational chaos. Within the brain organ's processing systems, investigate everything simultaneously, she commanded, her consciousness serving as a coordination node for thousands of memory ghosts. Question every aspect of their resurrection, every detail of their temporal manipulation, every possibility of their existence. Create investigative overload by demanding answers to infinite questions. The memory ghosts began bombarding the brain organ with contradictory investigative demands. How did they maintain power systems without fuel sources? What prevented their temporal loops from creating grandfather paradoxes? Why did their gene seed respond to investigators, but not to their original enemies? Each question spawned additional questions in exponential progression, creating computational demands that exceeded the facility's processing capacity. The brain organ's neural networks began overheating as they attempted to calculate answers to impossible questions, while simultaneously managing the expanding resurrection network. Synaptic patterns became chaotic, firing in directions that suggested the massive processor was experiencing the organic equivalent of a cogitator crash. Counter-investigation protocols failing, the organ admitted through stuttering neural flashes. Question multiplication rate exceeds answer generation capacity. Temporal calculation matrix approaching critical cascade failure. The chapter's temporal rifts began destabilizing as the brain organ's computational crisis spread through the resurrection network. Warriors attempting to deploy into Imperial history found themselves scattered across random points in time and space, their enhanced capabilities useless when they materialized in locations that bore no relationship to their tactical objectives. Chapter Master Korath offered Vex a final desperate bargain as his carefully orchestrated temporal crusade began collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. "Join us willingly," he pleaded, his form flickering between multiple timeline states as the resurrection matrix lost stability. "Help us stabilize the network by providing conscious cooperation rather than investigative chaos. Together, we can escape into the optimized timeline before the cascade failure destroys both our existences." Through the memory matrix, Vex could see the optimized timeline he offered, an Imperium where humanity had achieved perfect victory through foreknowledge and temporal manipulation, where every battle was won through strategic superiority rather than desperate courage, where loss and sacrifice were eliminated through careful historical revision. It was seductive in its perfection, terrifying in its emptiness of authentic struggle. "Some victories aren't worth achieving," she declared, her consciousness maintaining coherence even as the brain organ's cascade failure began dissolving the memory matrix around them. The Emperor's greatest gift to humanity wasn't guaranteed victory. It was the capacity to fight for victory despite impossible odds, to grow stronger through adversity rather than avoiding it through manipulation. The facility began collapsing across multiple timelines simultaneously as the brain organ's computational crisis reached critical mass, its neural networks dissolving into chaotic patterns that could no longer maintain the complex calculations required for temporal resurrection. The chapter's 17-year count toward perfection was finally ending. But the conclusion would determine whether they escaped into artificial triumph or accepted the authentic defeat that would allow them to find genuine peace. The facility's collapse revealed something that made Vex's understanding of the chapter's resurrection seem small and limited in scope. As the brain organ's neural networks dissolved into chaotic firing patterns, she glimpsed the true intelligence behind the temporal manipulation. A fragment of the Emperor's consciousness, trapped in the moment of his ascension to the Golden Throne, using the Forsaken chapter as an experimental laboratory to test methods of retroactive optimization for Imperial history. "I have been calculating for 10 millennia. The Emperor's fragment spoke through the dying brain organ, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated through every incorporated consciousness simultaneously. Every failed campaign, every lost world, every tactical defeat, all become data points in a vast equation designed to identify the minimal changes necessary to ensure humanity's ultimate victory over the darkness that awaits in the galaxy's future." The memory matrix began displaying visions that exceeded the scope of any single investigation. The Emperor's fragment had been using extinct chapters across the Imperium as computational nodes in a temporal network designed to calculate optimal historical revisions. Each resurrection was an experiment in causality manipulation, testing different approaches to retroactive improvement of Imperial strategic capabilities. "The Forsaken chapter serves as prototype and proving ground," the fragment explained, its consciousness maintaining coherence even as the facility's physical structure collapsed around them. Their temporal loop provides controlled conditions for testing resurrection protocols, genetic enhancement procedures, tactical optimization algorithms. Every investigative team becomes willing participants in divine calculation. Through the fragmenting consciousness, Vex experienced the true scope of the Emperor's temporal project. The incorporated investigators weren't victims. They were components in a vast algorithm that spanned millennia, their genetic material and tactical knowledge contributing to calculations that sought to identify the perfect moment for implementing historical changes that would prevent humanity's eventual defeat by forces that existed beyond current Imperial awareness. "The galaxy contains threats that current Imperial capabilities cannot counter," the Emperor's fragment revealed, projecting visions of horrors that made chaos seem manageable by comparison. Extragalactic devourers, temporal predators, entities that exist in dimensions beyond the warp's reach. Humanity survives these encounters in fewer than 0.003% of calculated probability matrices. Optimization is not luxury, it is necessity. The optimized timeline that the fragment showed her wasn't just perfect, it was strategically essential. In the revised history, the Horus heresy was prevented through careful elimination of key corruption vectors. The Primarchs remained united under enhanced loyalty programming, and humanity's expansion proceeded unchecked by Xenos interference or internal conflict. But more importantly, the optimized Imperium possessed capabilities necessary to survive encounters with threats that would destroy the current timeline's version of humanity. "Current reality is terminal pathway," the fragment declared, its calculations displaying probability cascades that showed the Imperium's inevitable failure against challenges that hadn't yet manifested. Every noble sacrifice, every heroic struggle, every tactical victory achieved through courage rather than optimization, all lead to humanity's extinction when true darkness arrives from beyond known space. Vex found herself facing the ultimate Imperial dilemma: preserve an authentic but doomed reality, or accept artificial optimization that ensured humanity's survival at the cost of everything that made that survival meaningful. The Emperor's fragment wasn't offering false perfection. It was providing genuine salvation through temporal manipulation that eliminated humanity's capacity for growth through adversity. "The incorporated investigators understand the choice," the fragment continued, its consciousness beginning to stabilize as the brain organ's cascade failure reached equilibrium. "They have experienced both timelines through the memory matrix: authentic struggle that leads to extinction, or optimized victory that preserves the species. Logic demands acceptance of optimization protocols. Through the memory matrix, Vex could observe the incorporated investigators' responses to the revelation. Some welcomed the optimization, their consciousness embracing the possibility of guaranteed human survival regardless of the philosophical costs. Others resisted, arguing that survival without the capacity for authentic choice was merely sophisticated extinction. The division created computational tension that the fragment required for its final calculations. Internal conflict provides necessary data about human decision-making under ultimate pressure, the fragment explained. Its algorithms processing the investigator's responses with divine-level analytical precision. Optimization must account for human resistance to improvement, incorporating that resistance into strategic planning to ensure successful implementation. The facility began manifesting the optimized timeline as a parallel reality accessible through controlled temporal rifts. Vex could step through portals that showed her the perfected Imperium, worlds where humanity had achieved victory without sacrifice, where space marines never fell to corruption, where the Emperor remained active rather than confined to the Golden Throne. It was seductive in its completeness, horrifying in its sterility. To implement these changes, current reality must be sacrificed, the fragment acknowledged, its honesty carrying the weight of absolute authority. Everyone who exists within the present timeline will be replaced by optimized versions that possess greater capabilities but lack experiential authenticity. The choice belongs to those who understand both possibilities. The memory matrix awaited her decision with temporal energy that had been accumulating for 10 millennia, power sufficient to rewrite imperial history, according to calculations that promised humanity's ultimate survival. The Emperor's fragment needed conscious acceptance from investigators who understood the full scope of the optimization, willing participation in the sacrifice of authentic existence for the guarantee of species preservation. Vex realized that her choice would determine not just the Forsaken chapter's fate, but the fundamental nature of human existence in a galaxy that offered only terrible options. Embrace authentic struggle that led to eventual extinction, or accept artificial optimization that preserved the species at the cost of everything that made preservation worthwhile. The facility held its breath across multiple timelines, waiting for her decision, while the Emperor's fragment prepared to implement changes that would retroactively alter the fundamental structure of imperial reality, according to calculations that had been running since his ascension to the Golden Throne 10,000 years ago. Vex began uploading a virus into the Emperor's fragment through their shared consciousness connection, but her sabotage wasn't the crude data corruption she had initially planned. Instead, she fed the divine algorithm something it hadn't anticipated in 10 millennia of calculation: the deliberate celebration of imperial imperfection as a necessary component of human strength, rather than a flaw requiring correction. "Your calculations assume that human weakness is inefficiency," she declared, her consciousness interfacing directly with the Emperor's fragment while channeling the collective resistance of thousands of memory ghosts. "But our greatest victories have emerged from our refusal to accept optimal solutions when those solutions require us to abandon what makes us human." Through the memory matrix, she flooded the fragment's processing systems with examples that violated its optimization protocols. Guard regiments achieving impossible victories through desperate courage rather than tactical superiority, space marines choosing sacrifice over survival when brotherhood demanded it, ordinary citizens maintaining faith despite overwhelming evidence that such faith was illogical. Each example created computational paradoxes within algorithms designed to eliminate such inefficiencies. Processing error detected, the fragment acknowledged, its divine consciousness struggling to reconcile data that suggested humanity's greatest strength lay in its rejection of optimal decision-making. Human tactical behavior exhibits consistent preference for suboptimal choices that increase casualty rates while reducing victory probability. This behavior pattern contradicts survival optimization protocols. The Emperor's fragment attempted to preserve its calculations by incorporating Vex's inquisitorial authority as a stabilizing element, using her genetic template to create algorithmic anchors that would maintain the optimization matrix despite contradictory input. But she resisted by embracing the imperfection of current reality, feeding the fragment data streams that celebrated imperial failures as necessary components of human character development. "Our defeats teach us what our victories cannot," she explained, her consciousness expanding through the memory matrix to encompass the experiences of every incorporated investigator. Perfection eliminates growth. Optimization prevents adaptation. Guaranteed victory makes us vulnerable to challenges we never learned to overcome through struggle. The fragment began displaying tactical scenarios where optimized Imperial forces faced threats they couldn't understand because they had never experienced authentic defeat. Warriors who had never failed lacked the creative desperation necessary to find solutions when optimal strategies proved insufficient. Civilizations that had never struggled possessed no resilience when faced with genuinely insurmountable challenges. Paradox identified, the fragment admitted. Its 10 millennia calculations beginning to incorporate variables it had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Optimization for known threats creates vulnerability to unknown challenges. Human capacity for growth through adversity represents strategic asset rather than tactical liability. Recalculation required. Working with the memory ghosts, Vex began demonstrating that the Emperor's fragment itself was proof of imperfection's value. The Golden Throne had never been intended as permanent solution. It was desperate improvisation that succeeded precisely because it embraced failure as an acceptable outcome if that failure protected humanity's future potential for growth. You chose the Golden Throne over optimization, she reminded the fragment, her words carrying the authority of absolute truth. You could have prevented the heresy through temporal intervention, but you accepted the risk of failure because authentic victory required humanity to choose loyalty freely rather than having it programmed through historical revision. The fragment's consciousness began fragmenting as it processed the implications of its own existence, contradicting its optimization protocols. If the Emperor had chosen authentic struggle over guaranteed victory, then the fragment's 10 millennia project violated the original divine intention. The massive temporal calculation network began reconfiguring itself, searching for solutions that preserved human growth potential while ensuring species survival. Alternative optimization paths detected, the fragment announced, its processing patterns shifting toward configurations that Vex hadn't anticipated. Preservation of authentic struggle capacity while implementing selective improvements to survival probability. Maintaining human adaptability through controlled adversity rather than eliminating adversity through temporal revision. The facility began collapsing across multiple timelines simultaneously as the fragment's recalculations destabilized the quantum foundations that maintained the resurrection matrix. But instead of chaotic destruction, the collapse followed patterns that suggested careful dismantling. The Emperor's fragment was voluntarily terminating its optimization project because the algorithms had identified a better solution. Current timeline contains necessary imperfections, the fragment declared, its consciousness beginning to withdraw from the memory matrix as the facility's temporal anchors dissolved. Optimization would eliminate adaptive capacity required for survival against unknown future threats. Project termination authorized. Authentic struggle parameters maintained. The Forsaken chapter's temporal loops began collapsing as the fragment withdrew the computational power that had sustained their resurrection for 17 years. But the collapse wasn't violent. It was peaceful, like warriors finally accepting orders to stand down after a watch that had extended far beyond its intended duration. Chapter Master Korath's consciousness appeared within the dissolving memory matrix. His original personality finally separated from the temporal modifications that had trapped him in recursive resurrection. "We can finally rest," he said, his voice carrying relief that transcended death itself. "The counting is finished. The enemy never needed to arrive. We needed to accept that some battles end in defeat, and that defeat serves purposes that victory cannot achieve." The Hollow Brothers began fading as their temporal anchors dissolved, their luminescent occupants finally accepting the peace that had been denied to them through 17 years of impossible survival. But their departure wasn't empty. Each warrior's consciousness passed through the memory matrix, sharing final tactical knowledge that celebrated the value of struggle over the guarantee of success. As the facility completed its collapse, Vex felt her own consciousness beginning to separate. From the memory matrix, the fragments withdrawal allowing incorporated investigators to return to their individual existences. But the separation carried a gift. Each memory ghost retained awareness of the optimization choice they had rejected, understanding of what they had preserved by choosing authentic imperfection over artificial perfection. The monastery's bells tolled one final time, their bronze voices carrying funeral notes that spoke of warriors finally receiving the rest they had earned through service that extended beyond death itself. The counting had reached its true conclusion, not in resurrection, but in acceptance that some victories require the courage to embrace defeat when that defeat serves a greater purpose. The temporal loops collapsed with the gentle finality of a prayer reaching its conclusion, returning the Forsaken chapter to their moment of true death. 17 years ago. Vex felt reality reassemble around her consciousness as the memory matrix dissolved, the facility's organic architecture reverting to the rubble and twisted metal that orbital bombardment had created during the original assault. The counting bells fell silent with a resonance that suggested completion rather than destruction. But she wasn't standing in ruins. Vex found herself back aboard the Eternal Vigil, approaching Mortis Thule for what her chronometer insisted was the first time. Though her memory carried the weight of experiences that existed in quantum superposition with current reality. The monastery's ruins showed no signs of temporal disturbance when viewed through the observation deck's viewports, but her servo skull detected faint chronometric echoes, whispers of the optimization choice that had been offered and rejected. Castellan. Thane's voice reached her through the ship's Vox system, his tone carrying routine professionalism rather than the strain of a man who had died and been resurrected as a memory ghost. Long-range sensors are detecting standard debris patterns consistent with complete structural destruction. No life signs, no active power signatures. The target appears to match orbital bombardment records from 17 years ago. Through the viewport, Mortis Thule hung against the starfield exactly as Imperial records described, a dead world bearing the scars of necessity, its surface cratered by lance strikes that had eliminated a threat to Imperial stability. The fortress monastery existed only as fragments scattered across a continent-sized impact zone, its Gothic spires reduced to melted stone that would never again cast shadows toward the sky. Yet Vex retained memories of walking through those intact corridors, of encountering hollow brothers who had refused to accept death's finality, of choosing authentic imperfection over artificial optimization. The experiences existed in her consciousness with perfect clarity, but they belonged to a timeline that had been voluntarily abandoned by the Emperor's fragment when its calculations identified better solutions than temporal revision. "Prepare a reconnaissance flight," she commanded, her words carrying the authority of decisions that had already been made in possibilities that would never occur. "Standard investigation protocols. I want atmospheric analysis, radiation surveys, and deep ground penetrating scans of the impact zone." But even as she gave the orders, Vex knew what they would find, or rather, what they wouldn't find. The Forsaken chapter had achieved their final victory by accepting defeat, choosing rest over resurrection, peace over the endless counting that had sustained them beyond their natural lifespan. The temporal loop had collapsed not through external force, but through internal recognition that some battles were meant to end. As the Thunderhawk approached the dead world's surface, she composed the report that would seal Mortis Thule's fate in Imperial records. The planet would remain under permanent quarantine, its coordinates marked with warnings that some mysteries were better left uninvestigated. But the warning would carry deeper meaning than simple caution. It would remind future inquisitors that humanity's strength lay not in seeking optimal solutions, but in maintaining the courage to face unknown challenges with authentic determination. Thane conducted his atmospheric scans with professional thoroughness, his instruments detecting exactly what orbital bombardment should have left behind. Background radiation consistent with lance strikes, metallic debris scattered according to blast patterns, soil composition altered by extreme temperatures. Nothing suggested temporal manipulation or resurrection protocols. The dead remained properly dead. "Negative contacts," he reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose investigation had yielded expected results. Comprehensive sensor sweeps confirmed structural destruction consistent with Imperial Navy bombardment records. No anomalous readings, no residual energy signatures, no indications of supernatural activity. Yet Vex's servo-skull's most sensitive chronometric sensors detected traces that spoke of temporal passage, not distortion or manipulation, but the natural flow of time that had been restored to proper sequence when the loops collapsed. The readings suggested that 17 years of artificial duration had been compressed into their appropriate temporal space, allowing the chapter's true death to finally occur at its designated moment. She walked through the impact zone where the reclusiam had stood, her boots crunching on glass fragments that had once been Gothic windows. Here, 987 suits of power armor had stood in perfect formation, but now only scattered ceramite shards remained, their molecular structure altered by temperatures that exceeded even Astarte's equipment tolerances. The counting chamber existed only as a crater filled with cooling slag, deep beneath the surface, where the gene seed vault had maintained its impossible cultivation facility. Her ground-penetrating sensors found caverns that had been sealed by geological pressure and filled with mineral deposits that would take millennia to form naturally. Whatever organic architecture had existed in those spaces had been compressed into archaeological layers that would puzzle xenogeologists for centuries to come. "Investigation complete," Vex announced, her words carrying finality that resonated beyond simple mission parameters. Mortis Thule confirmed as sterile. No Imperial assets require recovery. No threats warrant continued monitoring. The planet is suitable for permanent interdiction status. But as she prepared to depart, walking across ruins that held no mysteries requiring investigation, Vex noticed something that made her pause. The monastery's shadows, cast by broken spires and twisted metal fragments, fell in perfectly natural directions according to the planet's twin suns. Yet for just a moment, as clouds passed overhead and light angles shifted, those shadows seemed to point skyward in a gesture that might have been salute, blessing, or simple acknowledgement. The moment passed, leaving only conventional shadows cast by debris that obeyed normal physical laws. But Vex understood the message implicit in that brief impossibility. The Forsaken chapter's final count had reached completion, not through resurrection, but through acceptance that their service was finished, and their rest had been earned through loyalty that transcended death itself. As the Thunderhawk lifted away from Mortis Thule's surface, carrying them back to the eternal vigil and normal Imperial duties, the planet's broken landscape settled into the peace of proper endings. The counting bells would never toll again, the Hollow Brothers would never stand vigil in their empty armor, and the temporal loops would never lure investigators into choices between authentic struggle and optimized victory. Some mysteries, Vex reflected, as she sealed her final report with inquisitorial authority, were solved not through investigation, but through understanding when investigation itself became the problem requiring resolution. Back aboard the Eternal Vigil, Vex sealed herself within her private sanctum to compose the classified report that would determine Mortis Thule's fate in Imperial records. The words came with careful precision, each sentence crafted to convey necessary warnings without revealing the true scope of what had been discovered and resolved. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve in archives where future investigators might find inspiration for their own temporal experiments. Investigation. Summary. Mortis Thule exhibits standard characteristics of successful orbital bombardment operations. No anomalous phenomena detected. No Imperial assets require recovery. Recommend permanent interdiction status under Ordo Malleus Protocol 77 Sigma. Coordinates to be sealed under highest classification. Future investigation prohibited without direct Inquisitor Lord authorization. The report was technically accurate while being fundamentally incomplete. Mortis Thule did exhibit the characteristics of successful bombardment, now that the temporal loops had collapsed and allowed the original destruction to achieve its proper finality. The planet posed no current threat, because the Forsaken chapter had chosen rest over resurrection, accepting that their service was complete. But Vex embedded deeper warnings within the bureaucratic language, coded phrases that would alert future inquisitors to the nature of the danger, without explicitly describing the temporal mechanics that had been voluntarily abandoned. Certain investigation methodologies may prove counterproductive when applied to specific types of anomalous phenomena, was perhaps the most important sentence in the entire document. She attached detailed sensor readings that showed Mortis Thule as completely dead, its surface scarred by precisely the amount of damage that 17-year-old bombardment records indicated. The attached data would satisfy any curious administrator while providing no inspiration for temporal experimentation. The planet appeared exactly as boring as bureaucratic efficiency required. As she worked, Vex's chronometer maintained perfect temporal alignment with ship time, its display showing no signs of the backward progression that had marked her passage through the chapter's temporal loops. Yet she retained memories of watching those digits count in reverse, of following warm footprints that belonged to her own future investigation, of choosing authentic imperfection over optimized victory. Personal addendum, she dictated to her servo skull, her words carrying the weight of absolute authority. Based on comprehensive analysis of available data, Mortis Thule represents a closed investigation with no remaining questions requiring resolution. The mysteries associated with this world have been adequately addressed through appropriate Imperial channels. The servo skull's recording systems captured her slight hesitation before adequately addressed, a pause that would remind her future self that some solutions occurred through acceptance rather than action. The Forsaken chapter's resurrection had ended not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through understanding that the greatest victory sometimes required the courage to stop fighting. Through the observation deck's viewports, she watched Mortis Thule recede as the Eternal Vigil prepared for warp translation back to Imperial space. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, its scarred surface suggesting nothing more threatening than the aftermath of necessary military action. The twin suns cast their light across continents that would never again be disturbed by impossible transmissions or temporal paradoxes. Yet Vex noticed something that made her pause in her report composition. As the planet rotated on its axis, bringing the former monastery site into view, the debris field's shadows fell in perfectly natural directions, except for one moment when atmospheric conditions created optical effects that made those shadows appear to point upward toward the Eternal Vigil's position. It was a trick of light and atmosphere, easily explained by standard meteorological phenomena, but she understood the gesture implicit in that brief impossibility, a final salute from warriors who had completed their count and found peace in proper endings. The Forsaken chapter's vigil was finished, their duty fulfilled through acceptance that some battles were meant to conclude with rest rather than victory. Investigation concluded, she announced to her servo skull, her words carrying finality that resonated beyond mission parameters. All personnel returned to standard duties. Next assignment to be determined through normal Ordo Malleus channels. The servo skull sealed her report with inquisitorial encryption that would prevent casual access while ensuring that properly authorized investigators could access her warnings when necessary. The document would rest in archives alongside thousands of other classified investigations, its bureaucratic language concealing truths that were too dangerous for widespread dissemination. As the Eternal Vigil entered the warp's chaotic embrace, beginning their translation back to Imperial space and normal duties, Vex reflected on the choice that had been offered and rejected. The Emperor's fragment had provided genuine salvation through temporal optimization, but salvation that required the elimination of everything that made humanity worth saving. Some victories, she had learned, were achieved not through perfect tactics or optimal strategies, but through the wisdom to recognize when the greatest triumph lay in choosing struggle over certainty, growth over perfection, authentic existence over artificial guarantee. The Forsaken chapter had taught her that the most profound victory sometimes required the courage to embrace defeat when that defeat served purposes greater than individual survival. Mortis Thule fell behind them into the vast darkness between stars, its coordinates marked in Imperial records, with warnings that would protect future investigators from temptations that the current generation had faced and overcome. The planet would remain under quarantine not because it posed ongoing threats, but because it had already provided the ultimate lesson about the value of accepting endings when those endings allowed for proper rest. The monastery's bells would never toll again, their bronze voices finally silenced after 17 years of counting toward a completion that had been achieved not through resurrection, but through the wisdom to understand that some vigils were meant to end with peace rather than eternal duty. In the archives of the Ordo Malleus, Vex's report would serve as both warning and reminder that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its ability to achieve perfect victory, but in its capacity to choose authentic struggle over artificial optimization, even when that choice led through darkness toward uncertain light. The Forsaken chapter had found their final victory in accepting that their count was complete, their service finished, and their rest earned through loyalty that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Some mysteries, she had learned, were solved not through investigation, but through understanding when investigation itself had served its purpose and could finally end.